Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, I'm going to talk about things to be on the lookout for and things to do in the garden in January. I'm actually going to be shooting 12 of these videos this year. This will be the first one, so hopefully they're going to be helpful to folks, especially people who are behind me. Just to let you guys know, I'm in zone 7B, almost in zone 8, and so if you're in zone 4, 5, or 6, obviously the things that I'm talking about in these videos, you'd be following behind me. Those of you who are in zone 8, 9, or 10, if you haven't done some of these things as you see them during the year, you may want to get on them pretty quickly. The first thing, in January, there's just not really a whole lot that just has to be done in the garden, and a lot of it is really planning. As soon as the Christmas is cleared away at all the independent garden centers and all the box stores and everything, that's going to be the best time of year for you to go shop for seeds. They put all the seed racks out in those stores, and like I say, by the time, sometimes, if it's April when you're putting your garden in, or even May if you're, way up north, by the time you get around to going and getting your seeds, they can be a little bit picked over. So I would suggest that you go and grab them now and keep them in a dry place until you're going to use them. And also go ahead and buy your fall seed. This is something I do every year because I start my fall vegetable seeds, lettuce and brassicas like broccoli and that kind of thing, in July, late July or in August. And frequently when I go to purchase seed, it's non-existent. They've switched over to Halloween or whatever is going on in those places that you shop. You can still obviously get a lot of those things from mail order, but if you want to shop in person, frequently they're just not available. So go ahead and think about your fall vegetables as well. Search for your area online and find a vegetable planting chart. You can, like for me, I can search Central North Carolina vegetable planting, and I can pull up a guide, and that guide will tell me if I'm doing things from seed, when can I start the seeds indoors, if I'm doing them from seed, when I would plant seed outside, or if I was buying plants that were already starters from a garden center or my own starters that I'd started indoors, when those would go in the ground for each particular different type of vegetable. So grab that chart. It's definitely available all over the country for your area. I'm sure there's one for East Kansas and West Kansas. I mean, they're going to be different charts, different timings. If you haven't watched my setup that I built last year for my seed starting setup, I'll link that video up here. I use a rack with some LED lights and some fluorescent tubes. If you watch that video, I've never done a follow-up on that video, but the fluorescent tubes definitely outperform the particular LEDs that I bought. That doesn't mean that they're going to outperform all LEDs, but I bought kind of equal cost fluorescents and equal cost LED lights. You'll see it in that video. And spending the same amount of money, the fluorescents definitely outperform them. I've got to get mine set back up. The rack's actually sitting right here in the yard because I have some construction going on in the house, but very soon I'll be starting some seeds. And like I say, you'll be able to follow along with me if you're in my area, because you'll see those videos going up. Next up on the planning list is mulching for the spring. And timing is everything on your spring mulching. If you know you're going to need to remulch your bed spaces this spring, try to do it just before things start to generally wake up in your area. For me, sometime around March the 15th is when crabgrass and a lot of our annual weeds typically germinate. That's obviously changeable, depending on temperatures and that kind of thing. So if I was remulching established space in my area, I think sometime around mid-February to late February would be the ideal time to mulch, because I would cut off the light from those weed seeds and prevent a lot of them from germinating early in the spring and just kind of overrunning my beds. A lot of times people don't start on these things or do these things until, mid to late April or even May. And by that time, a lot of those those weeds have germinated, and then you end up in a fight with them before you can mulch. And so keep that in mind. Also, right now is the time to plan for new spaces. And I know that some of you don't want to be planting right now, but you could certainly be out defining those spaces. I just did a series of videos in this backyard, 6 videos. I'll link the first one up here in the corner. It's actually about doing some soil testing, and then from there, I went through and showed how to lay out the beds, how to put in the mulch. All of those things that were done in those 6 videos could actually be done in the winter time and get you way ahead and ready to just purchase plants in the spring and plug them in the ground. The third thing on my planning list is actually driving around and finding winter interest plants in your area. I think this is extremely important. 95% of the yards in this neighborhood I live in and the previous neighborhood I lived in the winter time, it is just nothing. There's nothing. There's no consideration whatsoever in winter interest. And I don't care where you live, there are plants in your area, somebody's got them in their yard that are interesting in the wintertime. And it's great to just kind of go around and look at those things now. Visit an arboretum, visit a botanical garden, they're still open in the wintertime, and find plants that still have winter interest, like this purple on this loropetalum right here is an example. In my area, there's some osmanthus fragrans back here that are actually in bloom in January right here behind me, and they're super fragrant. As you move further north, it might be conifers that are beautiful in the wintertime that have blue foliage, or just interesting weeping, things. Maybe things that go dormant, like deciduous trees, like but they're weeping cherries, or Japanese maples, which are beautiful in the wintertime, cutleaf maples. And just go, ride around and take a look in January. It may not be that you can find them in your area at that time of year or want to work in the yard that time of year, but write them down. When you head out to your garden center in the spring, frequently what people end up doing is loading up the car with things that are in flower, and then all the things in your yard flower at the same time every spring, and it's beautiful. It's a showstopper, and then it's gone, and you don't have a lot of color the rest of the year. So I do encourage you, and I will say this in all 12 videos, every month, go and take a look around and write things down and just make notes. It may be that you don't need it now or don't have a place for it, but it's something that you could add interest to your yard in September or January or July, when a lot of things in your area, in your yard, have no color and are just kind of dormant at those times. Another thing I plan for, but it's too early to do, is fertilizing. I use an organic fertilizer on all my shrubs and trees every year, and for me in my area, I'll do it sometime between mid-February and mid-March, and it's one of those things that I'll pick up if I'm at a store right now, because a big bag of something like plant tone, or last year I used the Job's Organics plant food, and the year before that I used plant tone. You can use holly tone if you need to lower your pH, but I definitely don't in my area, so I use plant tone. I rotate back and forth on fertilizers. I don't like to repeatedly use the exact same fertilizer. It's probably not going to be good for me to get a sponsor on this channel by saying don't use the same fertilizer over and over and over again. But they all use different, different sources of nitrogen, different sources of different, things for their, to acquire those nutrients. I don't want to build anything up in my yard, and so I will rotate and recommend folks rotate the type of fertilizer that you're using on a year-to-year basis. I only fertilize once a year. It takes a lot more material to use organic fertilizer, so keep that in mind. It will cost you a little more money, but it's great because it just feeds the soil, and the soil will feed the plants. But if you're out and you see a big bag of plant tone or that Job's Organic or some sort of organic tree and shrub fertilizer in a 16, 18-pound bag, like I say, it's going to cost you a little bit. Go ahead and grab it. I'll link down below, what I'll be using this year from, and I'll just order mine from Amazon. The last thing I would talk about that's planning and not actually doing is some pruning. There may be some things in your yard that you would prune now. I'll talk about those in a minute. But a lot of things you would be pruning later in the spring, late winter, early spring. Make sure you know the plants that are in your yard. If you can identify them, or maybe through going to an arboretum or someplace like that, you can see the plants, you can see the identification on them, figure out what you have in your yard, and then likely I have a video on it, and in that video it will include when to prune it. That's kind of key. This loropetalum is an example behind me, actually blooms on last year's wood, and so this thing's going to bloom very, very early in the spring with little pink frilly flowers, and after it finishes flowering would be the time for me to really get this thing under control if I wanted to, and it does need some shaping. But I know loropetalum needs to be pruned after it flowers, and that's going to be true with azaleas and rhododendrons and lots of things. And then there are lots of things that don't bloom until they bloom on new growth and they can be pruned in the late winter, and that will encourage more new growth. And the more new growth you have on a plant that blooms on new growth, the more opportunity you have for flowers. And so kind of find out what's in your yard if you don't know, and then, like I say, likely I have a video on it and you can figure out. If I say prune in the late winter, that means that's something that blooms on new growth or doesn't bloom at all. That would be, you know, there are lots of things that we're not really growing for flowers, we're just growing for foliage. Or I say prune after flowering in the spring, and that's very important. Hydrangeas, I've got an entire video on pruning all the different types of hydrangeas, if you know what types of hydrangeas you have, that kind of thing. So hopefully my channel can be helpful on those things, but you do kind of need to know to not go out in your yard and just start hacking everything off in mid-February because you have a 65-degree day. You need to do it with some knowledge of, you know, there are some things that you're going to cut flowers off of if you do that. Okay, and then, you know, that was the planting part of pruning. There are things that can be pruned now. A lot of your perennials that have died back to the ground, you can go ahead and clean them up if you want to. I typically don't. I usually wait until February to really start cleaning out the beds and that kind of thing. Things like hosta and super cold hardy perennials, if you want to go ahead and take the dead foliage off the top of them, you can. But like I say, again, I don't. My hellebores, I do go ahead and prune. I've got a hellebore pruning video on this channel, and the oldest growth on those I do cut back as the new growth is coming out on the center, and that encourages more flowers. Puts the energy into the new growth and the flowers for the winter and the spring. Instead of in that old foliage, so that's time to do that. But things like butterfly bushes that really do need to be cut down in the winter, there's two right here. I usually, like I say, I wait until February, but I am planning on them. I do know that they're there, and I know that sometime around mid-February they're going to go down to about 18 inches in height, something like that. So know what you have in order to plan on the pruning for the spring, and some of the more cold hardy things that you want to go ahead and prune. I'm not going to include fruit pruning in this video. If you have fruit trees and, you know, things like grapes or blackberries or blueberries and those kinds of things, they're going to be different timings across the whole country, and I do not want to confuse anyone. If you have those things, I guarantee you either a land-grant college in your area, like North Carolina State University is right here beside me. It's a great horticulture and agriculture program. They have a website that includes all the timings on pruning for fruit plants in North Carolina. And so I use that as, you know, to my advantage. If you live in Ohio or California or wherever you live, I guarantee you one of the agriculture schools in your state have websites on when to prune your fruit plants, and that's going to be important knowledge. You know, go on. There's probably going to be really long documents that are, you know, put you to sleep at night. But you can figure out when to prune each of your fruit plants. The best time of year to do that. You do need to be pruning fruit plants. That most fruit plants get issues, especially if air doesn't move through them very well. So a lot of the pruning that you're going to do on your fruit plants is just thinning them and allowing good air movement through them. So keep that in mind, and like I say, I'm not going to include it, but I will point out that that information should be easily accessible to you. One quick additional note on pruning though, if you have dead branches on things, you can go ahead and remove those, and a lot of times when things don't have leaves on them, it's a great time to get inside of them and see what is you know, what's died in the middle of it, and things that can be pruned out that way. Big leaf hydrangeas, it's definitely not time to prune them, but while they don't have any leaves on them, you can go in and prune out all the dead material that's on the inside of them. I have a few plants in this yard that just have some dead and broken limbs in them, and certainly in January when nothing else is going on in the garden, that's a great time to clean that kind of stuff up. If you can dig in your area, and that's probably like zone 6B down to 10, when your plants are dormant like they are right now, this is a great time to be transplanting them. And so keep that in mind. When you're winter planting or winter moving anything, you can end up putting them in kind of a boggy space. You know, the ground is going to be wetter, and through the process of moving them, keep in mind that you don't want to overwater them. Make sure you're raising them up a little bit. Those of you who are in colder areas where the ground is frozen, as soon as the ground starts to thaw out some, that is going to be the best time to move your dormant plants, the plants that are sleeping, while they're sleeping. If you're moving an evergreen shrub like this Laura petalum, has some foliage on it, I said don't prune it because of the flower issue, But if I was going to move this plant, okay, assume that I'm going to do about 30% damage to the roots, you know, that they're only going to have maybe 60 or 70% of the roots are actually going with it because I'm chopping them off. I need to do the same thing on the top. I will take about 30 or 40% off the top of this plant in the process of transplanting it. And I find that takes away a lot of the transplant shock. If I dig this thing out of the ground, damage lots of roots, don't cut anything off the top, this plant will struggle to do that. Like I say, I will be removing a lot of the flowers for this year. Who cares? The plant needs to be successfully transplanted. It won't do me any good with flowers on a dead plant. So do prune your plants that you're transplanting. And like I say, if you can dig in the ground, it is time to do that, especially with super cold hardy things like roses and those kinds of things. Anything like that. Roses would also be on my pruning list for January as well. Water can be a good thing and a bad thing in the wintertime. It's typically when the soil is wetter, and I always tell people to try to stay off your lawn in the wintertime because when it's wet like that, if you're putting a lot of traffic on it, you're definitely going to compact it. You know, any weight, any traffic you're putting on a lawn in the wintertime is definitely creating compaction. It's also creating uneven areas because a lot of times those footprints, you know, won't come back, and so you end up with ruts and that kind of thing. So try to stay off your lawn in the wintertime. In terms of watering your shrubs and trees, anything that you have in containers, anything you're overwintering in containers, you can get a lot of dry air this time of year. So make sure you're keeping an eye on watering your containers. If you've bought something from a nursery and you're storing it in a container, it has fertilizer in that pot, and occasionally when I had my nursery, we would pull the covers off. About now, you know, we would cover through Christmas because nobody was at the nursery. Sometime in the first or second week of January, as soon as it was warm enough, we'd actually pull the covers off, turn the water on, and flush all that fertilizer out of those pots because it really builds up in the container. So keep that in mind. If you have container plants, you may want to go out and water enough that water pours out of the bottom for, you know, 60 seconds or so, and then you're good to go there. It just washes the salts out of those containers. Watering things in the ground, I'm in the southeast United States, and you know, the soil's usually pretty wet in the wintertime. It's not something I have to worry about a whole lot. If I've recently planted something, obviously I'm going to keep an eye on it. Those of you who are in the, you know, the Southwest and areas where you continue to have dry air, you do need to continue to water through the winter. Remember, water is an insulator, and so you know, it takes it's a good thing to have moisture around your plants. Don't drown them. You know, you could drown things just as easily in the wintertime, especially newly planted things. Would be really, really easy to overdo the watering on. So, you know, don't love them to death. So obviously I'm not going to cover everything in these videos that you could possibly do in a January garden. If I've missed something, and I'm sure I have, feel free to write it down in the description, something you're doing in the garden, something you're thinking about doing in the garden for this year, and it may help people in the future as they find this video. Again, I'll be back in February and be doing one of these each month. And if you subscribe to my channel, you will actually see me doing some of the things I just told you that I'll be doing in my January garden. Thanks for watching.